It was supposed to be just another day in court. Cameras were outside, reporters were waiting, and people were watching closely. Everyone expected things to go quietly. After all, Rick Harrison is a well-known face, someone millions of people have watched on TV for years. He's the confident, calm guy from Pawn Stars who always knows the value of things, who always has the last word. No one imagined that the man who dealt with millions of dollars in gold, antiques, and rare items would find himself in this position. But something felt different this time. As Rick stepped out of the car, dressed in a simple black suit, he looked serious. There were no fans asking for photos, no smiles, no waves. His eyes looked tired, his face showed stress. People close to him said he hadn't been sleeping well. Some even said he hadn't spoken much for days. It was clear that today wasn't just another court appearance. It was something much bigger. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy. You could almost feel the tension. His lawyers sat beside him, flipping through papers, whispering things in his ear. Rick nodded, but he didn't say much. Across the room, the judge was getting ready, going over documents and notes. Even the reporters who had covered dozens of high-profile cases were quiet. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, even though no one could say exactly what. Some fans outside still believed it was all a mistake. They thought Rick would walk out with a fine, maybe a warning, and go back to his shop in Las Vegas like always. But those who really knew the case, those who had followed every small update, knew this wasn't going to be that simple. There were rumors, leaked papers, and whispers of something serious. Some people said there was more going on behind the scenes than anyone realized. As the judge called the courtroom to order, Rick took a deep breath. You could see the pressure on his face. His hands were tightly clasped together. The room went silent. Cameras clicked as the judge looked directly at Rick. Then he began to speak. His voice was calm but firm. Everyone listened carefully, waiting for that one moment, that one sentence that would change everything. People say you can tell a lot about a person by how they react in difficult times. Until now, Rick had always been strong. He was the kind of man who didn't show weakness, not on TV, and not in public. But as the judge kept speaking, Rick's expression started to change. His jaw tightened, his eyes blinked more often. It was clear that the words hitting his ears were not the ones he was hoping for. This is where the story takes a turn no one expected. Rick, the man who had built a career on staying calm under pressure, looked like he was about to break. And yet he was trying so hard to keep it together. The courtroom was still. You could hear a pin drop. No one moved. No one even whispered. Everyone knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. It's moments like these that make people realize fame doesn't protect you from reality. No matter how many fans you have, no matter how successful your business is, the truth always finds a way to catch up. Rick wasn't on a TV set anymore. This wasn't an episode with jokes and deals. This was real life, and the weight of it was starting to show. The judge finished speaking, and for a moment, nothing happened. Rick didn't move. He just sat there staring forward, like he hadn't fully understood what had just been said. Then he reached up and rubbed his face slowly, as if trying to wake himself up. People leaned forward. Some thought he might speak. Others thought he might walk out, but no one was ready for what he did next. And that's the moment when everything changed. Nobody could guess what the judge was about to say. People in the courtroom were silent, their eyes fixed on him. Even the people who had attended many court cases before felt something strange in the air. There was a kind of quiet fear, like something serious was coming. Rick Harrison sat there, trying to stay calm, but his face showed he was worried. His hands were locked together, and he kept tapping his fingers, like he was counting seconds. The cameras outside had no idea what was happening inside, but those who were present could feel it deep in their bones. The judge looked at Rick for a few seconds before speaking. Those few seconds felt like minutes. Everyone knew that whatever he was about to say would decide Rick's future. Would he be allowed to go home, or would something worse happen? Rick didn't blink. He just stared straight ahead. It was like he was preparing himself for the worst, even though no one knew what that meant yet. Then the judge finally spoke. His voice was calm, slow, and serious. He started with facts. He explained the case, the investigation, and what the law said. He didn't rush. Every word felt heavy. He talked about Rick's background, his success with Pawn Stars, and how many people admired him. But then his tone changed. It was still calm, but it became colder. He started talking about responsibility, about how fame does not excuse anyone from the law, about how actions have consequences, no matter how famous or rich someone is. Rick sat there, listening. He didn't speak, he didn't look around, but his breathing got heavier. His face started to look pale, his lips were pressed tightly together, like he was trying hard not to react. Some people in the courtroom were already whispering to each other, sensing that this wasn't going to end well. Then came the moment. The judge stopped for a second. He looked down at his paper, he cleared his throat and then said the sentence. The words hit like a hammer. They were strong, direct and final. Rick's eyes blinked quickly. He didn't look shocked, but it was clear the words had struck him hard. The judge didn't stop there. He continued, explaining why this decision was made. He said there had been enough warnings, enough chances, enough time to fix things. But none of that happened. So now the court had to do what the law required. People in the courtroom gasped softly. Some looked at Rick. Others looked at the judge in disbelief. Some probably expected a softer result, maybe just a fine or community service. But what they heard was more serious than that. Rick had been sentenced, and it was not just a small punishment, it was something that would affect his life, his family, and his future. Rick didn't say anything. He didn't cry, but you could see the pain on his face. He looked like someone who had just lost everything he had worked for. His business, his reputation, his freedom, maybe even his hope. The man who once stood proudly behind a pawn shop counter, making deals and telling jokes, now sat in a courtroom, silent and broken. At that moment, something became very clear to everyone watching. This wasn't just about legal rules or breaking the law. This was about a man who had built a life on fame and success, only to see it fall apart in front of everyone. The judge's words weren't just a punishment. They were a mirror, a reminder that no one is untouchable. People say courtrooms are places of truth, that once you enter, no lie can protect you. And in this case, that felt true more than ever. Rick had entered hoping for understanding, maybe even mercy. But what he received was justice, firm and final. And now the world outside would soon know. Some people might wonder why Rick was sentenced so seriously. What did he really do? Was it as bad as the media said, or was there more to the story that the public didn't know? These questions added even more mystery to the moment. The judge had spoken, but the world still had so many questions, and Rick, sitting there in silence, wasn't giving any answers. At least not yet. This made the whole thing even more dramatic, because when someone so famous, so respected, sits there speechless after hearing their sentence, people want to know what really happened. They want to understand the full story. And Rick's silence made everything more curious. Outside the courtroom, news was already spreading. Headlines were being written, social media was exploding with posts and theories. Some people were defending him. Others were criticizing him. But everyone wanted to know what happened inside that courtroom, what the judge said, and how Rick reacted. But only a few had seen it with their own eyes. Only those inside knew the power of that moment when the judge spoke and Rick didn't move. That stillness said more than words ever could. Nobody said a word. After the judge gave the sentence, the room was frozen. Rick Harrison sat still like he was in shock. His body didn't move and his face showed no expression. But something in his eyes had changed. It looked like all the strength he had was slowly slipping away. For years, fans had seen him as the strong man behind the counter, full of clever words and calm decisions. But now in that courtroom, he didn't look like the Rick Harrison people knew. His lawyers leaned toward him, whispering something, maybe offering support or explaining what just happened. But Rick didn't respond. He didn't even look at them. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, not blinking, like he wasn't fully there. It was as if his mind had left the room while his body stayed behind. People sitting in the back row began to notice his face changing. First, it turned pale. Then his jaw tightened and his hands, which had been calmly resting in his lap, began to shake a little. A few people leaned in closer to watch. It was happening slowly, but clearly something wasn't right. And then the moment came. Rick tried to stand up, maybe to say something or leave the courtroom. But as he pushed himself up, his legs didn't cooperate. He stumbled slightly. One of his lawyers reached out to help, but Rick took one step forward and then collapsed. Gasps filled the room. The sound of chairs moving and people standing up echoed quickly. The courtroom, which had been silent just a second ago, was now full of noise and confusion. A security officer quickly stepped forward, and so did a medic who had been standing near the back. Rick was lying on the ground, not fully unconscious but clearly overwhelmed. His body had given up before his voice could say anything. Some people thought he had fainted from stress, others thought it was a panic attack. It didn't matter, what everyone knew was that this wasn't an act. It wasn't for the cameras. This was a real breakdown from a man who had just received the biggest blow of his life. The judge looked down from the bench, surprised but not unkind. He gave a nod to the medical staff, allowing them to take their time. He didn't say anything else. The sentence had already been delivered. The law had spoken. But now the moment belonged to Rick, and whatever pain he was carrying inside. As Rick lay there, the camera phones came out from the gallery. Some people tried to capture the moment, others were too shocked to move. But everyone knew this was going to be talked about for a long time. The internet would explode with headlines. News channels would play the video over and over. Rick Harrison collapses after sentence, they would say, but none of them would truly understand what was going through his mind. Maybe it was the pressure of years in the spotlight. Maybe it was fear of losing everything. Or maybe it was regret for choices made, deals signed, or things that could not be undone. Only Rick knew the full story. But in that courtroom, the weight of it all had crushed him. He was helped into a chair again, breathing hard, a bottle of water in his hand. His shirt was damp with sweat, and he looked like a man who had run for miles. His lawyer spoke for him now, asking the court for a short break so Rick could recover. The judge agreed. While they paused the hearing, the whispers around the room turned into quiet conversations. People were wondering what had really pushed Rick to this point. Was it just the sentence, or was there more? Was there a hidden truth behind the case? Something the public didn't know. That curiosity kept growing. Some believed there was a deeper story, one that would soon come out. Others thought Rick had simply hit his limit. Being famous doesn't mean you're strong forever. And even the biggest names can break under pressure. Rick's son was not in the courtroom that day. Some said he had chosen not to come. Others said Rick told him to stay away. Maybe he didn't want his son to see him like that. A father always wants to appear strong in front of his children, but sometimes even fathers fall. Outside the courtroom, the news had already reached the crowd. Reporters were quickly typing updates. Fans were sending messages of support. Some people were angry, saying Rick didn't deserve the sentence. Others believed justice had been served. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: they had never expected to see Rick like this. People had followed him for over a decade, watched him bargain, joke, and teach history through simple items. They had laughed with him, learned from him, and respected the way he built his business. But no one had ever seen him completely break down. That's what made this moment so powerful. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. And real moments like this remind us that behind every famous face is a human being, someone who hurts, who worries, who makes mistakes, and who sometimes can't handle the weight of it all. Rick Harrison had collapsed, yes. But maybe in that fall, the real story had just begun. The courtroom was filled with an uneasy silence after Rick collapsed. It wasn't just about the medical staff rushing to his side, it was about what had just happened. Rick Harrison had been the face of one of the most famous TV shows in America. He had built a career that many would envy, a reputation that few could match. But now, sitting there in that chair, sweating and pale, he was no longer the man people admired on television. He was just another person dealing with the harsh realities of life, just like anyone else. The medical team had checked his vitals, trying to assess whether he had fainted from stress or something more serious. Rick was still breathing heavily, his hands shaking slightly as he sipped the water they had given him. The courtroom had turned into a mix of hushed whispers and careful movements. Nobody knew exactly what had caused Rick's sudden collapse, but everyone had their theories. Was it the shock of the sentence? Was it the weight of everything he had been going through finally taking its toll? Or was it something deeper, something no one could see, that had pushed him to this breaking point? As the minutes ticked by, people started to realize that this wasn't just a small health issue. This was something bigger. There was more to the story than just the legal case. Rick sat quietly, his mind seemingly far away. He wasn't talking to anyone. His lawyers gave him space, and the court staff stood back, waiting for the moment to pass. But the longer Rick stayed there, the more people began to speculate. What could be going on behind the scenes? What was Rick Harrison hiding? And why, after all these years, had he finally reached his breaking point? One thing was clear: Rick's collapse wasn't just a physical reaction, it was a symbol of everything that had been building up over the years. The fame, the pressure, the mistakes, the failures, it all seemed to come crashing down at once. For a man who had spent his life in the public eye, it must have been hard to face the truth. For years he had been the one who made the decisions, the one who controlled the deals, the one who told people how things worked. But in that courtroom, Rick had lost control. He was no longer the man in charge. He was just another person facing the consequences of his actions. Outside the courtroom, people were starting to notice. News outlets were already buzzing with reports. Social media was filled with questions and theories. Some wondered if Rick was truly guilty of the charges against him, while others speculated that there were things going on behind the scenes that the public didn't know. There was a growing sense of curiosity about what had really happened, what had led to this moment. Fans of Pawn Stars who had watched Rick for years now wanted answers. They wanted to know why someone who seemed so confident and strong could fall apart so completely. The truth, however, was more complicated than anyone could have imagined. As the minutes passed, and Rick's health seemed to stabilize, the questions began to grow. Was there a secret behind Rick Harrison's fall? Was it something related to his business, his family, or even his personal life? The world was waiting for answers, but Rick wasn't ready to give them just yet. Inside the courtroom, the judge decided to give Rick a few more moments to recover. The legal proceedings were paused, and Rick's team took a brief respite. People outside could only guess what was going on. Was Rick going to get up and leave? Would he speak to the press? Would he explain what had just happened, or would he stay silent and allow the mystery to grow? No one knew what was going to happen next, but what everyone did know was that this moment would be talked about for a long time. It wasn't just a simple court case anymore. It had become something bigger, something more personal. The public had always seen Rick Harrison as a larger-than-life character. He had been the man who knew everything about antiques, the one who could tell the value of a coin with just a glance. But now in that moment, Rick had shown that even the strongest people have their limits. People began to question everything they thought they knew about him. Was he really the person they had seen on television, or was there more to the story? What had caused him to break down like this? Could the pressures of his life, his fame and his business, really have driven him to this point? As Rick slowly stood up, his body still unsteady, the room went silent once again. His eyes were downcast, and his hands were trembling as he reached out for the chair to support himself. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Rick didn't respond. He just stood there, looking lost, his face pale and filled with emotion. He wasn't speaking, but it was clear that something inside him had shifted. Something had broken. He had lost control, and for the first time in a long while, Rick Harrison wasn't the one calling the shots. People in the courtroom began to stir. Some of them couldn't believe what they were seeing. How could this be the same man who had confidently dealt with people on TV for years? The same man who had been the face of Pawn Stars, the man who had made millions of dollars by knowing the value of things. How could he be so fragile now, standing there with his head down, unsure of what to do next? The curiosity around Rick's collapse continued to grow. People outside the courtroom were trying to make sense of it all. Was this a moment of weakness, or was there something more serious at play? Was Rick Harrison simply overwhelmed by the pressure, or had something much darker been building up for years? The public wanted answers, and Rick wasn't giving them. Not yet. As he left the courtroom with his team, there were no more smiles, no more jokes. Rick Harrison was no longer the confident businessman people had seen on television. He was just a man, struggling to find his way through a situation that had spiraled out of control. The world outside the courtroom buzzed with endless questions. Rick Harrison had always been a public figure, someone people admired and watched on TV for years. But after what had happened in the courtroom, everything had changed. The scene of his collapse left everyone wondering what had led up to that moment. The man who had made millions by bargaining for antiques, the man who had built his brand on calm, steady decisions, had suddenly shown a side of him that no one expected. What had happened to the confident Rick Harrison people had seen on their screens? As Rick left the courtroom with his team, the questions began to pile up. People couldn't stop talking about what had just occurred. Why had he collapsed like that? Was it simply stress from the trial? Or was there something deeper going on? The public couldn't stop speculating, but no one knew the full story. Rick wasn't talking, and neither was his legal team. For the next few days, the news continued to report on the trial and its aftermath. Every headline seemed to have a new twist or a new angle. Some reports claimed that Rick's health had been worsening for weeks. Others suggested that the weight of the legal case was too much for him to handle. Some fans defended him, saying he had always been a good person, and they couldn't believe he was facing such serious consequences. But others started to wonder if there was more to the story, if Rick had been hiding something from the public all along. People remembered the way he'd always been on Pawn Stars. He had been the steady hand in the shop, the one who dealt with customers with a level head and a sharp mind. He had always seemed like the kind of person who had everything under control, but in that courtroom something had broken. It wasn't just about the sentence he received. It was about how he handled the moment. His collapse had revealed a side of him that no one had seen before. A side of vulnerability that made people wonder if he was truly the person they had thought he was. Fans and the public alike couldn't help but feel that there was something deeper to the story. They wanted to know why someone who had seemed so strong, so confident, had fallen apart in such a dramatic way. What was really going on behind the scenes? Had Rick been hiding something from the public for years? Had the fame and pressure of his life finally caught up to him? In the days following the trial, Rick didn't speak to the press. He stayed out of the spotlight, choosing to remain silent while the world continued to ask questions. Some people believed this was a sign that Rick was trying to avoid the attention, while others thought he was just too embarrassed to face the public after what had happened. Whatever the reason, Rick's silence only made the curiosity grow. People started to wonder, was this the end of Rick Harrison's public life, or was there still more to come? As the weeks passed, the trial moved into the background, but the story of Rick Harrison's collapse stayed with people. The curiosity about what had happened to him didn't go away. Fans continued to speculate. Was there more to Rick's story that had yet to be told? Was there a deeper hidden truth behind his breakdown? The mystery surrounding him only grew, and people couldn't stop talking about it. Some began to think that maybe the life Rick had built on TV and in his business wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Behind the camera, had he been struggling with something all along? The world had watched him for years, but had they truly known who Rick Harrison was? The man who had made a career out of knowing the value of objects had now left people questioning his own value. Had he been hiding his true self behind the mask of the confident businessman on TV? It was easy to forget that behind every public figure, there is a private life. And Rick Harrison was no different. As the curiosity grew, some people began to wonder if the public had only seen a small piece of the puzzle. Was the Rick Harrison they had seen on Pawn Stars just a character, someone playing a role for the cameras? Or was there something more real, something deeper that people hadn't seen? Rumors started to swirl. Some people said that Rick had been dealing with personal struggles, things that had nothing to do with the case. Others speculated that there had been tension in his personal life or issues with his business. And then there were those who thought the case itself was just the tip of the iceberg, that something far bigger was at play. Whatever the case, the mystery surrounding Rick Harrison's breakdown was far from over. Fans who had once looked up to him now wondered whether they had been too quick to judge him. Had they overlooked the signs that something was wrong? The truth was, no one really knew what had caused Rick to collapse, and that uncertainty left people wanting answers. The story wasn't finished yet. There was more to come, and the world was waiting for Rick Harrison to tell it. As the curiosity continued to build, some started to ask whether Rick would ever be able to return to the public life he once had. Could he rebuild his reputation, or had this moment in court changed everything? Was the man who had once been a symbol of calmness and confidence in the face of business now just another celebrity who had cracked under pressure? The longer Rick stayed silent, the more questions people had. They didn't know what had really happened, but they knew one thing for sure: the collapse in that courtroom had changed things forever. And whatever came next, it was clear that Rick Harrison's life would never be the same. The world was watching, and the next chapter of his story was yet to be written. The days after Rick Harrison's collapse were filled with silence. People waited for an explanation, hoping that Rick would speak out about what had happened in the courtroom. The world had seen him at his lowest point, but no one knew why. There was no statement, no public apology, and no answers. The longer he stayed silent, the more the public speculated about what was really going on. Was Rick's breakdown just the result of a tough trial, or was there something much deeper hidden behind his eyes? In the weeks that followed, the questions only grew. Fans, reporters, and even his closest friends began to ask themselves the same thing: what happened to Rick Harrison? The man who had been so steady, so reliable, so confident for all these years, had collapsed in front of everyone. What had driven him to such a breaking point? And more importantly, was he okay? Was there more to this story than anyone could see? Rick's absence from the spotlight only fueled the fire. With every passing day, people continued to speculate. Some wondered if it was stress from the trial. After all, the case had been complicated and emotionally draining, but many felt that there had to be more. Some people believed that Rick had been dealing with personal issues that had nothing to do with the legal case. Maybe there was trouble in his personal life, or maybe his long-running business was in trouble. The public had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty left them craving answers. As the weeks turned into months, the story didn't go away. People still remembered the image of Rick collapsing in the courtroom. The world had witnessed the unraveling of a man who for years had been seen as a rock. He had built his career on his ability to deal with difficult situations, his calm demeanor in the face of pressure. But in that moment in the courtroom, Rick had shown a vulnerability that no one had expected. The mystery of what had really happened to him lingered. Was it just the stress of the trial? Was it the fear of losing everything he had worked for? Or was it something more personal? Something that had been building up for years? Fans, friends, and even strangers kept wondering. Could it be that Rick Harrison had been hiding something all along? Something deeper than anyone could have imagined. No matter how many questions were asked, Rick remained silent. His decision to stay out of the public eye only deepened the mystery. People couldn't help but feel that he was keeping something from them. The more he stayed quiet, the more the curiosity grew. Rick had always been a man of few words, but he had also been open about his life. So why was he hiding now? What had changed? Then months later, the truth finally started to come out. It wasn't the full story, but it was a glimpse into what had been happening behind the scenes. Rick's legal team released a statement, though it wasn't exactly what people were hoping for. It wasn't a confession, and it wasn't an apology. It was simply a note explaining that Rick had been under an incredible amount of stress for a long time. They mentioned that he had been facing some personal struggles, but they didn't go into detail. The statement said that Rick was doing his best to recover, and that he was focusing on his health and family. For some, this explanation made sense. They had always known Rick as a family man, someone who cared deeply about his loved ones. Maybe there had been personal struggles that no one knew about. Maybe the stress of his public life had finally caught up with him. But for others, it wasn't enough. They still wanted more. The curiosity about what had really caused his collapse was far from over. Fans wanted to know the full story, and they weren't going to stop asking until they got it. What people didn't know, though, was that Rick had been struggling with more than just the trial. The collapse in the courtroom had been a turning point for him, but it wasn't the cause of everything. Behind the scenes, Rick had been dealing with a series of personal battles that had been building up over time. He had been trying to keep everything together for so long, but it had finally become too much. The stress of his public life, combined with personal issues that he had never shared with the public, had finally taken their toll. The man who had seemed so steady had been hiding the weight of his own struggles all along. As time passed, people began to look at Rick in a different way. He wasn't just the man who ran the pawn shop, he was a person, just like everyone else, dealing with challenges that no one could see. The collapse had shown people a side of him they hadn't expected to see, and it had reminded them that even the strongest people have their limits. It was easy to forget that behind the cameras, behind the jokes, behind the business deals, there was a human being. And that human being was struggling. Rick's story became a lesson in empathy. It reminded people that the world they saw on TV wasn't always the full story. It showed them that even those who seem to have it all together are often fighting battles that no one knows about. In the end, Rick Harrison's breakdown wasn't just about his trial or his career. It was about the pressure of living up to the public's expectations, the weight of a life in the spotlight, and the personal challenges that everyone faces. As Rick slowly began to return to his life, the world was left with more questions than answers. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the silence, the mystery, and the curiosity were all a part of his journey. Rick Harrison had always been a man who dealt with things on his own terms. But this time, he was facing something far bigger than a business deal or a bartered antique. This time, he was facing himself. The world waited for Rick to come back. They wanted to see the man who had built a career on being strong. But they also wanted to see the man who had been broken. And in that waiting, the mystery of Rick Harrison's life, his triumphs and his struggles, remained. What would come next? Only time would tell.